All right, hello everyone. So now we're going to move on to our next chapter in the biochemistry side of this course, which is talking about lipids. When we're introducing lipids, the main focus here is going to be on categorizing those lipids. I don't even know what this slide is. Okay, so lipids. First of all, there are two main categories of lipids. One of them is quite small and specialized, and that are the category of lipids that contain the steroid nucleus. So any molecule that has this right here, you know, three six-membered rings fused to a five-membered ring. This is a steroid nucleus. This isn't a geometry problem, right? These all represent carbons at all of these intersections, just like if we were in organic chemistry. It turns out that this kind of basic structure is seen in a lot of what are called steroids, but really what we would think of them as are like hormones, cholesterol. There are a few other signaling molecules in your adrenal glands. They have this pattern and they are mainly involved in signaling the cell, do this, do that, that sort of thing. So they're not abundant, they're not present in huge concentrations, but they are really, really important to governing the cell's behavior. There was one really interesting fact that I learned long ago in my biochemistry class that a single molecule of testosterone binding to a receptor on a cell can change the entire chemistry of that cell. So very, very sensitive to these sort of things. But they are kind of weirdly in their own class when we're talking about lipids. Most of the time when we're talking about lipids, we're talking about fats or fatty acids, things that contain a fatty acid. So you're going to see that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about fatty acid-based lipids. And then there's one particular lecture on these steroid lipids. Okay, but these are the two main classes within lipids. Characteristic of lipids is they're not soluble in water. They're non-polar. Lipose means fat, although we'll see that fats are kind of just a subset of all the lipids that exist. They have hugely important roles, and we'll talk about those, both cell membranes, signaling hormones, making sure that different things that otherwise wouldn't be soluble, other nonpolar molecules such as vitamins, are soluble within your body. They're also used for the long-term storage of energy. They have roles of protecting and insulating your organs, and they're, again, key components of cell membranes. Okay, so again, the main, mostly when we're talking about lipids, most of the lipids within our bodies fall under these fatty acid categories, meaning that they contain a fatty acid. And what is a fatty acid? A fatty acid is this long carbon chain and a carboxylic acid group. Okay, so either lipids are made of fatty acid, but really we'll see that these fatty acids are combined together to form various types of lipids. Those include waxes, triacylglycerols, and glycerophospholipids. There are also these what are called sphingolipids, which are kind of these specialized lipids that are found mostly in your brain and in nerve cells. Okay, the biggest one, the biggest category of lipids that's the most important one is the triacylglycerols. Okay, and really we're going to talk about the different lipids in terms of the building blocks that make them up. Okay, so a triacylglycerol has glycerol and then is connected to three fatty acids. And we talked about fatty acids, how they're those long chains. Glycerol is what we would, if we were in organic chemistry, we would call 1, 2, 3 pentane triol, but it's a 3-carbon alcohol where there's an OH group on each one of those different carbons. So those are connected to those fatty acids to form a triacylglycerol. And those are by far the most common lipids within the cell. The other really important one are these glycerophospholipids. They're especially important in membranes. And they start off very, very similar. They also have this, actually, let me color code here. They also have this glycerol component, and they contain two fatty acids. But then the third component is what's called an amino alcohol that's bound using a phosphate. Okay. This is really important, and we'll see. We're going to talk about each one of these classes in particular, but just to try to give you the punchline so it's a little easier to follow. This portion in purple right here, whoops, is very polar, which is why these are usually components of membranes, are these glycerophospholipids. They are also these sphingolipids. I have such a hard time with that word. And they're kind of their own separate thing in that they're not glycerol based. So they contain sphingosine, where this portion here, it's almost going to be like a fatty acid, but it's not. It's like its own kind of thing. It's also just a long carbon chain, but it's specific to this type of molecule. And then there's no glycerol. You do have one fatty acid component and another, this same component that we saw before, this phosphate connecting an amino alcohol. Okay. They play very similar roles to the glycerophospholipids, right? You can see that they're very structurally similar. They have their own unique portion, the sphingosine. They are found primarily in nerves and in your brain as well. Okay, so they're like a very specialized type of lipid. And then these steroids as well. Okay, so again, we talked about how they were kind of in a class of their own in that they don't contain any fatty acids whatsoever, and they're characterized by these fused carbon rings. Do we miss one? Do we miss waxes? I guess not. Okay. Well, the other one would be waxes, which are also contain a fatty acid component, but then on the other side is just a long chain alcohol. Okay, so starting out with the classification of lipids, which is the whole shtick of the chapter, right? That's what we're going to be focusing on completely. There are two main branches. One of them are the steroids, which contain those fused carbon rings, and the other ones are all made up of, or at least have a fatty acid component. Waxes, not a huge one in human biology for sure. If you were a bee and you're making beehives, you obviously make a lot, produce wax as part of your structural sort of element. They're kind of I don't want to say they're unimportant, but they are not what we really focus on when we're thinking of lipids. They tend to have very specialized roles. The triacylglycerols, these are really what you think of when you think of fats in your body, storage of fats, all that sort of good stuff is the triacylglycerols. And again, they have this base glycerol component. Let me try to color code here. This glycerol that's connecting three different fatty acid chains. The glycerophospholipids, they also have glycerol and two, not three, but two fatty acid chains, and then this amino alcohol component joined by that phosphate group. These are primarily used in membranes. And then these sphingolipids, which don't have glycerol, they instead have their own sort of sphingosine component, which we'll see what that looks like here in a second. Also one fatty acid, and then that amino alcohol connected by a phosphate. And they're mainly found in nerves and brain tissue. So kind of like very specialized phospholipids. Okay, so let's see if we can characterize these lipids based on their descriptions. For A, it contains a fused four-member ring system. What type of lipid would that be? Right, would it be, and these are our categories that we're choosing between. We're choosing between a steroid, a wax, a triacylglycerol, a glycerophospholipid, and a sphingolipid. Okay, if it's got that fused four-membered ring, it's going to be a steroid. Contains long carbon chains. Well, that's going to be any of those fatty acid type components, right? So that is, again, going to be the fatty acid side of our spectrum here. It could be any one of those categories will contain a long carbon chain, as well as contains a carboxyl group. That could also be any of those lipids, rather, from our fatty acid portion of the spectrum. Okay, and which of the following is not a characteristic of lipids? May contain a carboxylic acid group. Well, that would be a fatty acid, so that's going to be a lipid. May contain a four-ring structure. That's the steroids. Soluble in water. No, not going to be the case, right? So that is not a characteristic of lipids because they are mostly nonpolar.